When my father said, "You'll never be one of them," he didn't just mean the men in uniform, he meant anyone worth respect. That night, I was holding the folder he refused to touch. The folder with my name erased, and my brother's typed in bold. He looked straight at me, eyes cold, and said, "You'll thank me someday for keeping you in your place." But I didn't thank him. I stood there in the silence he created, realizing I had just lost not only my work, but at the last thread of his belief in me. And that was the night something inside me broke, and something else quiet but stronger began to rise. My name is Selah Quinn, and this is the day I learned that silence can burn louder than any scream. The highway curved through the frozen hills like a scar. Snow drifted over the windshield, and the old pickup groaned beneath the wind, same one I'd driven out of Montana 30 years ago. The engine still fought to live just like me. Helena hadn't changed. The same narrow main street, the same gas station with its flickering neon sign, the same church where everyone still whispered about everyone else. Only I had changed, at least I wanted to believe that. I wasn't coming home by choice. Mom was in the hospital cancer, taking what time she had left. Rick had called, his voice sharp with duty, not care. "Dad wants you back. Mom, she needs to see you one last time." That one last time cut deeper than it should have. I said I'd come, though we both knew it wasn't for him. That evening, the door creaked open to the same smell of wood smoke and whiskey. On the wall, Rick's photo in his mechanic's uniform hung like a trophy. Mine, the one Mom had framed when I graduated, was gone. Dad sat at the head of the table, silver hair, eyes like steel. "So you finally showed up," he said. I nodded. "Yeah? Guess so," he snorted. "Seattle never did have a place for dreamers." "I've made my own place," I said. He poured another glass, the amber light glinting off the rim. "Your brother works with his hands, not with fantasies. He builds. You just draw." Rick smirked, trying to hide it behind his drink. I kept quiet. Words never changed anything in this house. Dinner ended in clinking silverware and silence. Then Dad looked at me over his glass. "You can sketch 100 things, Selah, but you'll never be one of them." The air turned still. The fire hissed. I met his gaze steady. "Maybe you're right. But someday they'll read my name the way it's meant to be read." Rick laughed under his breath. Dad slammed the glass down. I picked up my bag. "I won't stay long," I said. "There's still work to finish." Outside, the wind bit hard against my face. I looked up at the sky, black, endless waiting. Somewhere above those clouds, something I'd built was almost ready to fly. And when it did, everything he believed about me would fall straight out of the sky. In Seattle, my work never had a name attached to it. In aerospace, women were still assistants even when they led the design. Hawthorne Aerosystems didn't care who drew the blueprints, only that the jets flew. I spent nights sleeping on my drafting table, surviving on instant noodles and caffeine, watching the sunrise through glass walls that smelled of ink and steel. I loved that life, the quiet, the precision, the feeling that my mind could reach the sky without anyone needing to see it happen. Then one afternoon, Rick showed up at the security gate, hands in his jacket pockets, grinning like he owned the place. He said he was in town, heard my company was hiring, and maybe his experience with aircraft repairs could help. Against every instinct, I vouched for him. I told myself it was harmless. A few tests, some maintenance work, nothing that could touch what I'd built. 3 months later, a headline hit the papers: "Rick Quinn, lead engineer behind Aurora V7. I read it alone in my apartment, my coffee gone cold. Hawthorne refused to comment, the silence more insulting than denial. I found Eli Morales, a junior engineer who respected me more than most. He looked uneasy. "Sometimes," he said, "history only remembers the loud ones. Then I'll make sure it remembers the right one," I told him. That night my father called. His voice buzzed through static. "Saw the article. Rick's doing us proud. You always were better at taking notes than leading, huh?" I didn't answer. The line went dead. Later, I opened the metal cabinet in my study. Inside was the original Aurora schematic, my signature, the security seal, the timestamp. I touched the ink still sharp after all these years and whispered to the photo of my mother beside it. "The truth's still here. It just hasn't learned to fly yet." Weeks passed. Mom's health collapsed. Rick called, his tone suddenly soft. Dad wants you home. There's paperwork for Mom's care. It won't take long. Helena was frozen when I arrived. In the hospital room, Mom's eyes flickered open, long enough to breathe out. Don't let his fear cage you, Seela. Her voice trembled like the machines beside her. That afternoon, Rick handed me a folder. Just some forms to keep the house in Mom's name, he said. I skimmed the pages, saw legal jargon, his company's logo, and too tired to think signed. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived from Hawthorne. Termination of employment. Transfer of patent ownership to associated contractor Rick Quinn. My heart stopped. I tore through my files until I found the original agreement, identical wording, identical date. The paper I signed for my mother's house had stolen my life's work. I drove to my father's, the newspaper still damp in my hand. Did you know about this? I asked. He didn't look up from his drink. Your brother turned an idea into reality. You should be proud. Snow was falling hard outside when I left. The road blurred white, like the world itself was erasing what was left of me. That night, Eli called again. They're using your blueprints for a government contract. If you stay quiet, your name disappears forever. My voice stayed calm. It doesn't need to be said, Eli. It just needs to appear when it matters. After he hung up, I stood by the window. Over the sound, a faint light blinked across the night sky, Aurora's first flight test. For a moment, I imagined the hum of its engines whispering my name, carrying the truth higher than anyone could silence. Mom died on a pale March morning. I took a flight back to Helena and watched clouds drift like pages from a life I'd once left behind. This time, I was coming home to say the last words to the only person who ever believed without asking for proof. The funeral was small and stiff, with that particular kind of town devotion. Everyone came to mourn and to praise Rick, the family's shining example. He read the eulogy about carrying the Quinn name into the world. Dad squeezed his shoulder, pride bright in his eyes. No one mentioned me. I sat near the back, the room folding around, a silence I'd learned to live in. When they carried the casket out, Dad leaned toward me and warned me not to make trouble, that it was Mom's day, not mine. I clamped my jaw and nodded. Outside, snow feathered the church steps, and a thick envelope slipped from the floral spray, landing at my boot. It was my mother's handwriting. That night, alone in the room where I'd once tucked childhood trophies away, I opened the letter. Her words unspooled like a map. Don't let fear box you in, she wrote. She told me she had kept a copy of the Aurora V7 patent in her bedside drawer, and if I ever needed proof, it was there. The drawer groaned when I opened it. Inside lay the original agreement, my signature, the lawyer's stamp, and a penciled note declaring me the original creator. She had known. She had saved it for me. By dawn, I walked into the post office and sent a single envelope to the Department of Defense Office of Intellectual Property. I signed my name across the flap. If they wanted to know who built Aurora, they would be told the truth. I left without an audience. Outside, the thaw creeping over the porch felt like the first small betrayal of winter. 3 days later, Rick came to my door, frantic and furious, when he learned the Defense Department had opened an inquiry at Hawthorne. He accused me of trying to ruin him. I said I only wanted the truth to survive. He slammed his fist on the table and called me jealous, an accusation that landed like a cheap shot. When Dad stormed in to defend Rick, the house spun into that old orbit of loyalty and shame. He struck me hard enough to sting. I wiped at my lip and told him the slap hurt less than the line he'd said when I was 18, the one that had lived inside me for decades. That afternoon, 2 federal agents knocked. I pulled the patent bundle from the safe and handed it over. One of the agents was Eli Morales. He stood there, no fanfare, just the younger man I'd trusted in the lab, and his steady, honest look said everything without a word. They needed me in Washington to testify. I told them I would go. That evening, Dad sat on the porch, cigarette ash, trembling at the tip, and said I was destroying the family. I reminded him that Mom had hidden the evidence because she anticipated this moment. He said nothing. For the first time, I saw fear in his face. The next morning, local news blared that Hawthorne had suspended Aurora V7 testing pending investigation. The town buzzed. Rick vanished. Dad locked up the shop and hung a closed sign. That night, the phone rang with an anonymous voice, warning me I could be erased from history if I kept going. I let it ring out. Then an unmarked envelope appeared on my doorstep containing a formal request from the White House, asking me to brief the National Ethics Committee about Aurora. I held the letter against my chest and whispered to the dark-telling mom I would make them hear my name, not for revenge, but because the truth deserved to fly. Washington was heavy with wind that afternoon, flags snapping against the marble face of the National Ethics Committee building. Eli met me at the entrance, his tone low and careful as he handed over my visitor badge. He told me to keep my answers short. I smiled, saying I didn't need them to hear everything, just the part that mattered. Inside the hearing room fanned out like a theater built for judgment. Senators in dark suits lined the semicircle papers, rustling like distant thunder. One of them, gray-haired and sharp, looked down at me. He asked if a woman like me truly believed she could manage a multi-billion-dollar defense project. My reply was calm. I didn't believe I had done it for 7 years. The whisper that followed rolled through the room like a wave. They brought out a document next the supposed transfer of ownership. My signature, copied cleanly, stared up from the page. According to Rick's submission, I'd handed my life's work over willingly. I told them the truth. I'd signed that paper in a hospital room, believing it was about my mother's house, not a patent. If they wanted answers, they should ask who wrote the contract, not who signed it. The young senator at the end of the table rose with a second file freshly verified. The corporate seal on Rick's contract was counterfeit. I let the silence stretch, then turned to the projection screen. Aurora's blueprints filled the wall, my notes, my codes, my dates. The same engineers who had doubted me stood to their feet. When it was over, Eli caught up with me in the hallway. They would release findings within 72 hours, he said, though rumors whispered that the president himself wanted to meet me. I told him I'd waited 30 years to be heard. 3 more days were nothing. That night, I turned on the television and saw my father's face. He told a reporter his son was the only Quinn who understood honor, and that his daughter had humiliated them all. I stood before the screen dry-eyed. Maybe I had been wrong to hope he'd ever be proud, but at least I could still stand without bowing. 3 days later, Washington hummed with speculation. Headlines questioned whether Rick Quinn had forged the future of American defense. I switched off the noise sitting in my hotel room where the curtains swayed in the draft. When the knock came, a courier handed me a letter sealed with the presidential crest, an invitation to the national recognition ceremony. The paper felt colder than it should have, heavier than triumph. The phone rang almost immediately. Rick's voice cracked through the line, ragged and desperate. He said I'd won, that Dad was drowning in shame, that if he died, it would be on me. I told him quietly that if our father died over the truth, then he'd never lived for honor. Then I hung up. Later that night, a White House advisor arrived, requesting confidentiality until the ceremony. He mentioned my father might be invited. I told him to give Dad a front-row seat he needed to see what truth looked like. By morning, my photo splashed across every outlet. "The woman who built the sky," the headlines read. Beneath them, hundreds of women left comments: engineers, mechanics, teachers, mothers. One wrote, "I'm 52, and I've had my work stolen 3 times. You made me believe I'm not invisible." I read until my hands trembled, realizing this fight was larger than me. That afternoon, Dad called one last time. His voice was tired, worn down by years of pride and fear. He asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with it, said he couldn't bear the town's gossip. I told him he once said I'd never be one of them, but now it was them calling my name. The line went silent. I didn't need to hear more. The night before the ceremony, an email came from Hawthorne. They wanted me back this time as director of engineering. My reply was short. I don't work for people who only respect me after someone else does. At dawn, Eli waited by the car that would take me to the White House. He asked if I was afraid. I smiled, steady and sure. I had been afraid once when silence was safer. Now I only wanted to hear how my name would sound when spoken aloud. I don't remember how that morning began, only the sunlight flooding Washington, and a sky so blue it felt unreal. The car stopped by the National Mall, where a sea of people waited. Flags rippled, music rose. Eli leaned close, whispering, "It's time." I touched the small medal my mother left me and stepped forward. The brass band played "America the Beautiful." The president stood at the podium, list in hand. Today we honor those whose work carried our nation's technology to new heights. Applause followed each name until he paused. The silence was complete. And finally, Sheila Quinn. The crowd erupted. I stood still as cameras turned, wind brushing my hair. Across the rows my father sat rigid, then slowly removed his old Air Force cap and bowed his head. Millions watching saw it, the man who once denied me now surrendering to truth. When I took the stage, the president smiled. "We owe you our thanks." I answered softly, "No. I only returned the sky to its rightful owner." Above us, Aurora V7, cut across the blue gleaming. Then over the loudspeakers, my mother's voice. "I just hope my daughter will be called by her name." I smiled. "I'm flying now, Mom." Weeks after the ceremony, I was summoned as a witness in the trial of Rick Quinn, charged with intellectual property fraud and falsifying federal documents. The courtroom overflowed with reporters and spectators. Rick sat pale and trembling at the defendant's table. My father was there too, called to testify. When the prosecutor asked Mr. George Quinn, "Do you know who truly created Aurora V7?" the room went utterly still. My father's hands shook as he rose. His eyes were wet, his voice thin but clear. "I once said my daughter would never be one of them," he said. "I was wrong. She built Aurora. And I'm ashamed I didn't believe her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The headlines later would call it the father's confession. For me, it was just the sound of truth finally spoken aloud. Outside, he caught up with me in the corridor, voice trembling. "Sheila, I'm sorry. I never knew you were that strong." I met his eyes and said quietly, "You don't have to apologize. Because for the first time, I heard you tell the truth." He broke down, gripping my hand. "Your mother would be proud." "I am too," I said. Rick was sentenced soon after. I didn't watch him fall apart. I only whispered, "You could have flown beside me, but you chose to break the wings." Then I stepped out into the sunlight. Warmth spilled across the courthouse steps, and for a moment, I thought I saw my mother's silhouette in the wind. Or maybe it was just the light finally setting me free. 3 months later, I accepted a teaching position at MIT. The lecture hall shimmered with morning light, rows of young faces turned toward me, not in doubt, but in respect. I opened the first slide, a photograph of Aurora V7 beneath it, the words dedicated to Margaret Quinn, the woman who believed in the sky. I said, "Someone once told me I'd never be one of them. Turns out I never needed to be. I only needed to be myself." That evening, I walked past the Washington Monument. The lights glowed against a new metal plaque, Sheila Quinn, Aerospace Engineer, Aurora V7 Project. I traced the letters and whispered, "Maybe he was right. I never was one of them. But today, I am free." In a quiet lab elsewhere, Eli Morales studied a new blueprint, Aurora 8, the Sheila Protocol. Beneath it, a photo of me and my mother smiled in the glow of blue light. Proof the dream hadn't ended, only begun again.